What's going on, everyone? John Matrix here. Hope you guys are all having yourselves a wonderful day so far today. So, got a video here by Arbitor Ian, and it's one that I'd really just hadn't kind of thought of before, but the idea of how the Primarchs got their names. It was an interesting one that he proposes here. So, we're going to check out this video by him. Again, as always, link down below in the description for Arbitor Ian's channel and for the original video without my reaction or commentary. But yeah, today we're going to check out how the Primarchs got their names, Warhammer 40k Easter eggs by Arbitor Ian. So, without further ado, let's go ahead and take a look at this here video. Bada bing, bada boom.
The Primarchs of Warhammer 40k are an interesting bunch. Lion L. Johnson, Horus Lupercal, and Angry Angron the Angry Marine couldn't be more different. But what's the inspiration behind them? Where did those names come from? And what are the mysterious origins of Raven, the Raven guy? So if you didn't know, 40k, especially old 40k, is littered with Easter eggs, references often jokingly to real-world history, events, or ancient mythology. The original writers were students of history and especially art history, and those influences are everywhere in the 40k background, from obvious historical analogues to shape.
There's definitely a lot of pop culture references with, you know, stuff to like Rambo and Aliens, but there's also various historical references, obviously, various Primarchal legions having Viking references, Egyptian references, etc., etc., etc. So, makes sense.
Everywhere in the 40k background, from obvious historical analogues to Shakespeare references. And in this, the Primarchs are no different. The names of the 18 Primarchs who led the Space Marine legions were invented over a number of years. Some were even given their names before Primarchs were part of the background, originally being generals or imperial commanders. And many of those names...
That's interesting. I didn't know at some point in time the Primarchs weren't actually a thing. They were just kind of considered generals, and then I guess got an upgrade as the lore came along. I guess that must have been like really like way back in the day, in the early days of the Warhammer history. Obviously that would have to predate the Horus Heresy series, because that's like littered with all the Primarch stuff, so that's interesting.
Are actually references to something else, being generals or imperial commanders, and many of those names are actually references to something else. Sometimes these references fit with their legion's backstory, and sometimes they don't. Sometimes the Primarch was given the name before the background for their legion was written, and sometimes the legion's background comes from the Primarch's name, so it's a mixed bunch. So let's go through all 18, and let's start at the start with one of the more well-known stories, that of the first Primarch, Lion L. Johnson of the Dark Angels. Lion L. Johnson's position as commander of the Dark Angels goes all the way back to Rogue Trader, where he has a few alternate spellings, like in this box out, where he's Lin L. Gonson, founder of the Dark Angels. But
Lin
the name
L.
we know him by
Gonson
actually makes his origin much more obvious. Lionel Johnson was an English poet from the late 19th century. His poetry was considered very traditionalist and austere, and he was a devout Catholic convert, but he was also a gay man, something that would have been scandalous and very illegal at the time. As such, his work often concerned his own deep shame of the sin he felt he'd committed and needed to hide from the rest of the world. His most famous poem, and one on exactly that theme, is called The Dark Angel. Dark angel with thine aching lust to rid the world of penitence, malicious angel, who still dost my soul such subtle violence. That's the first verse, but the poem carries on for much longer. I'll put a link below, but the connection to an intensely moralistic and monastic chapter who conceal a dark and shameful secret is pretty obvious. In 40k, the Dark Angels are obsessed with concealing knowledge of the Fallen, a faction of their legion that sided with Horus in the heresy, and which the chapter has spent the last 10,000 years trying to hunt down, lest anyone find out the truth. What's interesting here...
That's pretty interesting overall. Like, the idea that the Primarch's name and the entire faction was based on, you know, a writer from the 18th century, I think you said, or the 1800s, something like that. But yeah, just the idea that, you know, this writer kind of carried a guilt and shame, a personal guilt and shame, because at the time being gay was obviously pretty taboo. And that they're taking that writer's works and bringing it to the background of a Space Marine chapter and Primarch. That's pretty interesting, honestly. I don't know how many other things or universes do something like that. Have that kind of a, I guess, deep Easter egg reference. You know, even like when you look at Dark Souls games, you know, that's kind of the only thing that really comes to mind as I'm thinking about this. There's a lot of Easter eggs to like Berserk and some other anime and things like that you know, the Miyazaki, the creator of the Souls series, is, you know, really into and interested in. But other than that, I can't really think of a lot of other things.
1,000 years trying to hunt down, lest anyone find out the truth. What's interesting here is that every Loyalist Legion had some elements who sided with Horus. So the thing the Dark Angels flagellate themselves about isn't uniquely that shameful, especially not from the position of 10,000 years later. It's their own beliefs that cause them to be so ashamed of ever having sinned, which actually makes them a really good analogy for Lionel Johnson. Anyway, how much of that was actually intended in the Rogue Trader days is questionable, but it's one of the few where Games Workshop attempted to change the name later to try and make the reference a bit less obvious. Apparently on the Primarch's home world of Caliban, another reference, Lionel Johnson means the lion.
Yeah, Caliban. What is that? That's Star Wars. Isn't that Star Wars? I kind of want to look that up, but I don't want to like really take the time during the video. But I think Caliban is like a planet on Star Wars, right?
Of the forest, which suggests that over thousands of years of isolation, lion still means lion, but forests are called Johnsons? Okay, there's no second Primarch, so moving on, we have the third Primarch, Fulgrim, but unfortunately, he doesn't get as much of a story. In world, he's meant to be named after a mythological water deity from his home world of Chemos, but that isn't a reference to anything in real life. The best I've seen is that it's a play on words from the Latin fulgur, meaning lightning or flash, which I guess makes sense. He is quite flashy. Fulgrim is also called the Phoenician, which is an Easter egg, but not the one you think. In his backstory, he does preside over an artistic renaissance on Chemos, which I guess you could see as like a phoenix rising from the flames, but that's not actually it. The Phoenicians were an ancient civilization that existed around the Levant in the 3rd and 2nd centuries BCE. They were called that by the nearby ancient Greeks who traded with them.
Right.
And one of their most valuable exports was a very specific dye that couldn't be found anywhere else, a purple dye. So Fulgrim the Phoenician is actually a reference to the colour his legion's armour
Interesting.
is. He's Fulgrim from those purple guys. Onwards, we've got the fourth Primarch, Perturabo of the Iron Warriors. Now, the obvious thing here is to go, Perturabo sounds like perturbed. Maybe he's hesitant and a bit annoyed about it, but it's a bit cleverer than that. The Iron Warriors are, of course, famed for their attrition tactics, able to withstand huge losses and just keep going. Perdurabo was the motto of the British occultist Aleister Crowley, and roughly translated in Latin means I will endure, which absolutely makes sense. Crowley himself was active in the early 20th century, and after studying various...
Stop. Dude, I don't know why sometimes like my keyboard doesn't like I'm hitting spacebar to pause the video and it just doesn't do it or something like that. Anyway, I find it that actually just kind of like made me lose my thought. But I think he was talking about references to like Latin language, and that always fascinates me too, because Latin is, you know, like the root of a lot of languages in the world. So it always interests me when they use references and various things to Latin root words. I don't really know why, it just does. It always fascinates me.
Crowley himself was active in the early 20th century, and after studying various occult beliefs, developed his own religion, Thelema, which evolved over his life. His work was then a huge influence on many of the New Age and new religious movements that came later during the middle part of the 20th century. On the face of it, his study of magic and the occult and his obvious charisma as a sort of cult leader might have made the name a better fit for a different Primarch, but then multiple biographers of Crowley have described him as being self-confident, brash, egotistic, highly intelligent, arrogant and cruel, capable of immense physical and emotional cruelty, and showing a blind arrogance, petty fits of bile, and contempt for the abilities of his fellow men, which, yeah, that's the guy. That fits. Okay, fifth Primarch, Jaghatai Khan of the White Scars, an obvious one, I think. So the Scars are an analogue to the medieval Mongols and to some degree the much earlier Huns, both civilizations of horse nomads from Central Asia, famous for descending on the rest of the world as a horde of skilled cavalry fighters, which is also exactly what the White Scars are. The most famous leader of the Mongols was Genghis Khan, both
Mongolians on motorcycles, from what I understand, is what the White Scars kind of really are. They're one of the factions I haven't really delved too deep into yet. There's so many things in the 40k universe to get into. I still need to get into more of the backgrounds of the Primarchs. I did a video on Saint Celestine that makes me want to get into them a little bit more, and the Battle Sisters more. Still more things about the Tyranids. There's so much stuff to get into, and not in just so little time. You know what I mean? But yeah, the White Scars are pretty much from what I know of them so far. They're basically sci-fi Mongols on sci-fi Mongolians, I should say, on motorcycles. You know, they're hit and run cavalry. Faction
is also exactly what the White Scars are. The most famous leader of the Mongols was Genghis Khan. Both the titles Khan and Kagan are real-world titles that are then used by the White Scars in the fiction. Genghis Khan's second son and successor was Jaghatai Khan, and he was known as quite a just and lawful ruler, particularly compared to his father. And that's also how Jaghatai Khan is seen in 40k. He's the leader of this horde of bikers, but he's also one of the more relatable and honourable of the Primarchs.
I mean, it makes sense to pretty much, maybe not necessarily like one-to-one rip-off, but it just makes sense to use historical figures as reference for how you would want some of these characters to be portrayed. And I mean, you've got, a faction here that is literally based on Mongolians, so it only makes sense that the Primarch is based off of one of the greater leaders of the Mongolians at the height of their culture, I guess, if that's the proper terminology to use. So I would assume that probably goes the same with a lot of the other Primarchs. I would bet the what is it, Konrad Curze? He's the Primarch of the traitor guys. I can't think of the faction name, but I would assume he's probably based mostly off of like Vlad the Impaler. And then Russ? I can't remember his full name. The Space Vikings, the Space Wolves. He's probably based off of, I would think, like maybe kind of like a Beowulfish, or maybe what's the famous Viking? Famous Viking explorer that was also like Eric the Red, I think, is who I'm thinking of. I believe it's Eric the Red. I would assume he's probably based off someone like him. Roboute Guilliman is probably based off of like a Julius Caesar type character, I would bet, etc., etc. So it wouldn't surprise me if, as we go through this, that's what we learn essentially.
This horde of bikers, but he's also one of the more relatable and honourable of the Primarchs. Right, Leman Russ of the Space Wolves is next. Russ is one of the early ones. Both Russ and the Wolves went through a few changes in the early fluff before they settled on this whole Norse werewolf thing they have. Originally, Russ was just a human Imperial commander, and the Space Wolves were just a regular example Marine chapter. No longboats or ancient sagas in sight. So I would guess that the whole Viking thing actually stems from the authors working with the name they already had. The Russ were an ethnic group in early medieval Europe, prominent from the 9th to 11th century. They ruled over a state now known as Kievan Rus, which at its height covered a large part of Eastern Europe and would eventually lend its name to Russia, but they were actually descended from the Varangians, or Eastern Vikings, originally Norsemen from Sweden who'd settled along the Volga River, and that's the thread that leads them back to this guy and the whole Norse Viking theme. Interestingly, Space Wolf Terminator squads in 30k are called Varangir, probably a reference to the Varangian Guard, Russ mercenaries that served in the armies of Byzantium to the south. So the 7th Primarch, Rogal Dorn, has a little...
Just before he moves on, it's just... I actually just lost what I was thinking about. We're going to move on. I was thinking about something, and then he said something, made me think of something else, and my ADD brain completely lost what I was going to talk about. So if I remember, I'll pause and I'll get back to it.
In the armies of Byzantium to the south. So the 7th Primarch, Rogal Dorn, has a little less to it.
Ah, there it is. I just remembered. That's how my brain works. It's interesting also hearing about how some of these factions evolved. You know, the idea that the Space Wolves, and maybe probably, I would assume some of the other chapters of the Astartes, were really just like normal kind of soldiers. I guess you could say normal in the fact that they were Space Marines, right? But they didn't really have any kind of flair or theme to them. They were just another chapter. And then just as the time went by and they evolved them more, they've, you know, adapted various, like we've talked about, historical figures and events or whatever to give them more lore and background. So it's interesting to see that kind of evolution.
Of Byzantium to the south. So the 7th Primarch, Rogal Dorn, has a little less to him. He appears for the first time in Realms of Chaos during the story of the Emperor battling Horus, but there's not much else there. The best I could really find looking around wikis and things was that Dorn means stronghold in Old English and fist in Irish, so that kind of fits. There's also this idea that Rogal sounds a bit like regal, but that's a bit of a stretch to me.
It sounds, I don't know, Rogal Dorn, to me that sounds kind of like a Roman name. I don't know why, but I get the feel of like Roman kind of, I guess regal, like he said, you know, kind of fits that, but kind of a Roman aristocrat, Roman nobility, regalness, you know, that's just kind of the idea that comes into me is more kind of a Roman themed thing. I'm trying to think of like the Praetorian, not maybe not even a Praetorian. I don't think that's the proper word. There's a specific kind of terminology that they had, a specific name for. It's not like it's basically a general, but they also have like standing in the like political standing in like the Senate, I believe. I forget what it was called. Maybe it's a Praetorian. But I don't think so. I don't think that's the proper word. I think it was something else. But anyway, we'll move on.
Idea that Rogal sounds a bit like regal, but that's a bit of a stretch to me. But after Rogal Dorn, we get to the other really famous story, the Night Haunter Konrad Curze of the Night Lords. So despite everyone thinking this is a Batman reference, it isn't, or at least it wasn't the original intention. Joseph Conrad was a Polish-British novelist writing in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, just like the other two I mentioned, so maybe that era was someone's specific field of interest. His most famous novella is called Heart of Darkness, which tells the story of a mining company operative sent on a mission to the jungles of the Congo to track down another operative that's gone missing called Kurtz. When he finds him, Kurtz has gone mad, and it turns out he's been brutally ruling over the local people who sort of worship him as a savior. It was adapted into the 1979 film Apocalypse Now, which moved the action to the Vietnam War and the plot to a search for a rogue US Army colonel called Kurtz. Joseph Conrad, Colonel Kurtz, and we have Konrad Curze, a Primarch driven mad by visions and whose brutal idea of justice on his adoptive homeworld see him regarded as a feared savior. And to
well, then I guess I was wrong. I thought I you know, from the video that I did, I'd gone over before about one of his generals. I can't even think of his name now. It was a great video. But I thought he was more a reference to like Vlad the Impaler with his fear tactics, you know, his psychological fear tactics and his idea of justice, etc., etc. So, but I guess maybe I'm incorrect about that.
Justice on his adoptive homeworld see him regarded as a feared savior. And to really cement that, there's a few other references here. That planet is called Nostromo, after another Joseph Conrad book, Nostromo, which also gave its name to the spaceship in the film Alien. And one of my favourite ones, in Apocalypse Now, the protagonist on the hunt for Colonel Kurtz is played by Martin Sheen, and in 40k, Konrad Curze is eventually killed by an Imperial Kaladat assassin called Shen. Okay, number 9, Sanguinius of the Blood Angels is another pretty easy one, but it's quite interesting. Sanguis is just Latin for blood, so he's blood guy, leader of the blood guys. But also, sanguine is one of the 4 temperaments in the old medieval medical system known as humorism. Back then, a lot of doctors thought that diseases or various moods were caused by an excess of certain fluids in the body. There were 4. Too much yellow bile and you'd be choleric, that's short-tempered. Too much black bile and you'd be melancholic or lazy and sickly. Too much phlegm and you'd be phlegmatic, low-spirited. And too much blood and you'd be sanguine, optimistic, especially in hopeless situations, which I guess is a pretty good description of Sanguinius for the entire heresy story. And if you thought that was a simple one, here comes Ferrus Manus of the Iron Hands, which is of course just Iron Hand in Latin. And he has iron hands, so he's Iron Hand with his iron hands leading the Iron Hands. Yeah. He's also called the
Iron Hand of the Iron Hands leading the Iron Hands. Yeah, pretty easy.
So he's Iron Hand with his iron hands leading the Iron Hands. He's also called the Gorgon, which is meant to be because he's grim of aspect and kind of ugly. But of course, that's a reference to the homeworld of the Iron Hands, Medusa. The Gorgons are the snake-headed ladies of Greek myth, one of which was named Medusa. And of course, looking at them would turn you to stone, which wasn't pleasant either.
Yeah, was it Theseus? Or I don't remember. I can't remember off the top of my head. I don't remember. It was Theseus. I think it was Perseus, actually. Perseus was the one that killed Medusa, which goes into the Wrath of the Titan stuff. I could be getting my mythology mistaken here. My brain's kind of not working. I'm still kind of getting over like a stomach bug, so I'm still a little out of it.
It was named Medusa, and of course, looking at them would turn you to stone, which wasn't pleasant either. We're in the really easy middle bit of the Primarchs here. The 12th Primarch is Angron, who is angry and leads the World Eaters, who are also angry. I mean, I really think that's it. There's nothing else there. The 13th Primarch, Roboute Guilliman, is an interesting one. There's loads you could go into here. The name actually features the syllables ro and man, and, you know, the Ultramarines are Roman. Guile means cunning in English and in Old French, so I guess he's like a cunning Roman man, but apparently it's none of that. It's just taken from a random name found in a French newspaper while the writer was on holiday, according to the internet anyway. And to continue the theme, Mortarion.
That's kind of funny how some of these characters and their backgrounds and lore are like kind of like really detailed and thought out and based off of writers and some of their works, and then you got something like that. It's just there. He's just paper. Name it. It just, you know, you think of like some of those memes like I don't know if you guys have seen like one of the earlier episodes of Family Guy where Peter's talking to someone and they ask his name and he's trying to like lie and like Peter Griffin. You know, I don't know. Anyway.
While the writer was on holiday, according to the internet anyway. And to continue the theme, Mortarion of the Death Guard is another easy one. Mors means death in Latin and is the root of loads of similar words, from the French mort to the English mortal to about half the proper nouns in 40k. So the Death Guard are just led by Death Arian. Now, Magnus the Red of the Thousand Sons is a strange one. Magnus means great or big in Latin. Right. Magnus the Red is certainly big. He's meant to be a giant. But the main thing about him is that he's an extremely powerful sorcerer from planet Egypt. So I think this is mostly someone just writing a name in the book before the story had really been fleshed out. At the time his name first appeared in 40k, not much had been written about the Thousand Sons, other than that back then they wore red, something that would eventually become their heresy colours. Interestingly, planet Egypt in 40k is called Prospero, which is the name of the magician in Shakespeare's The Tempest. So there is a reference in there. Yeah. It's just not one that...
There's a lot of references to... there's a lot of various things named Prospero and various TV shows and games and stuff. Like, I can't necessarily think of them off the top of my head, but I know I've heard that name in a lot of various things. Like, I want to say one of the Final Fantasy games has a character named Prospero in it, or as at least a reference to it.
That features the Primarch. Also, while we're on the subject, Prospero's servant in the Tempest was a creature called Caliban, a sort of mutated, twisted, angry guy, and of course the Dark Angel's homeworld is called Caliban too, which is full of mutated and twisted monsters. Number 16, Horus Lupercal is next. Horus was, of course, an ancient Egyptian god. In the mythology, Horus was the son of head gods Osiris and Isis, but when Osiris is killed by his brother Set, Horus is hidden away and grows up in secret, eventually returning to battle Set for his rightful crown. It's a story familiar from lots of mythologies. Horus is particularly associated,
which I think is also kind of the reference of him fighting the Emperor, etc.
with inheritance and kingship, and, you know, getting his rightful place as the successor of his father, which is pretty apt already. Lupercal is Roman, though. The mythological founders of Rome, Romulus and Remus, were said to be nursed by a she-wolf as babies. In Latin, lupus means wolf, the Lupercal is the cave in which that happened, and the Romans actually had a fertility festival called Lupercalia in honour of all that. So Horus Lupercal is a mix of one of the two founders of an empire and a god famous for inheriting his rightful place as ruler. Primarch 17 is Lorgar of the Wordbearers. As far as I can tell, Lorgar isn't really a direct reference to anything. The closest we can get is that it kind of sounds like the word logos, which means law or deductive reasoning.
Right,
He also has a couple of other names. One is Aurelian, because he's seen as a golden being with golden skin, but the other is the Urizen, which is a reference to the 18th century poet William Blake, who constructed a whole mythology around his poetry. In that mythology, Urizen was a creator figure, a sort of deity that represented conventional reason and law. And like Lorgar, much of William Blake's poetry had a lot of religious themes. The joke here is, of course, that while Urizen and Logos are both references to deductive reasoning, Lorgar in Warhammer is the representative of blind faith in the divine, starting from the premise that gods definitely do exist and then casting around trying to find one to worship. Okay, Vulkan of the Salamanders is a relatively easy one with a lot connected to it. The Salamanders in 40k are hardy artisans with an affinity for fire and flame. In fact, that's why they're called salamanders. In various mythologies, the salamander was said to be either immune to fire,
like a dragon,
or create
kind
fire.
of a thing.
In Roman mythology, Vulkan was the god of fire, the forge, and metal.
That's another thing in a lot of Souls games. Salamanders are like these fire lizards that breathe fire or shoot fireballs, or and even in some Final Fantasy games are actually drakes or dragons or wyverns or whatever, you know, these fire breathing creatures or fire elemental creatures, etc. So another kind of more mythology references or whatever.
Fire. In Roman mythology, Vulkan was the god of fire, the forge and metalworking,
which is also Hephaestus in Greek mythology.
Symbol was a blacksmith's hammer, just like Vulkan in 40k. Also in 40k, the salamanders are based on the moon Prometheus, which orbits the planet of Nocturne.
Yeah, and Prometheus gave fire to humans.
Where Vulkan grew up, in the city of Hesiod. In Greek mythology, Prometheus was the titan who stole fire from the gods, and the first reference we have to that story in ancient writings is from the Roman poet Hesiod. In the myth, Prometheus is punished by the gods by being bound in chains and tortured. An eagle eats his liver every day, but he's immortal, so the liver regrows each night, and then the torture goes on forever. And that story is very similar to what happens with Vulkan himself during the Horus Heresy. Chained up by the Night Haunter, tortured every day, but unable to die because he's immortal. Right, I think the last two here are just a case of the writers needing to come up with some names really fast because they are Ferrus Manus levels of silly. Corvus Corax is the Primarch of the Raven Guard. Corvus Corax is the scientific name for the common raven. And Alpharius is the Primarch of the Alpha Legion. Alpha is the first letter of the Greek alphabet, so calling the very last legion
Alpha, Omega.
is sort of a joke. But the Black Library authors have run with this over the years. There's an in-world rumour that he was actually the first to be found, and his twin brother is called Omegon, which is the last letter of the Greek alphabet. But all of that is written after the fact. I would guess the reason he's called Alpharius is because someone had a deadline to hit. Anyway, there we go. 20 Primarchs named after A bunch of stuff, sometimes careful allusions to literary history that show you just how deep the references in 40k go, and sometimes not. And to be honest, the whole of 40k is a bit like this. Part of the fun of 40k is all those historical, literary, and mythological references all mixed up together.
It is one of the things that intrigues me a lot about the 40k stuff too, because again, I've said this numerous times in numerous videos. I love mythology. Like, I love mythology and history in general. Most of the history that I really get into is kind of, you know, tactics and war, but just I love mythology in general. Greek mythology in particular, I'm very, very fascinated with, you know, Hercules and Achilles and the Odyssey and all of those stories, but also, you know, ancient Egyptian mythology and Viking mythology, Beowulf, and a lot of those stories, and I don't know as much about Japanese and ancient Chinese mythologies as I do about you know, the other cultures that I've referenced, but all those things are very fascinating to me, and so I love seeing those references pop up in things, and that's why the Space Wolves are one of the factions that I would love to get into the most. I've had a few people ask me to look up the Minotaur faction. I forget what they're called off the top of my head right now, but it's one that I haven't really gotten into yet, so it's one I would want to look into. And like the Dark Templars are obviously kind of really a reference to the Templars of the Middle Ages during the Crusades, etc. So I just it makes me want to learn more, knowing that the lore is based off of other mythology that I'm already very into. It just makes me want to get into it even more.
Historical, literary, and mythological references all mixed up together in one big pot. So there's a few more videos I could do like this. Let me know if that's something you want to see. Thanks for watching.
All right, there we go. There we go. Another great video by Arbitor Ian, as usual. Like always, there will be a link down below in the description to Arbitor Ian's channel and to this video if you want to watch the original video without my interruptions, without my commentary, without the pauses, etc., etc. You should go over there anyway and give this video a like if you enjoyed it, as Arbitor Ian obviously has put the time and effort into creating this video for me to react to, so he definitely deserves the like and some love. So go over there, check out his content, like his videos if you want to, give him a sub, all that good stuff. See if you want to support him even further over on Patreons, etc., etc. But I kind of given really all my thoughts as we were going through the video. One thing I would be interested in, it seems I would love to see kind of like a timeline of how the lore was put together for the various factions from earlier on to now. I mean, it it seems like some of the earlier books, factions, characters were fleshed out a little bit more based on other writers and writers' works. And I mean, it makes sense. You know, when you're a writer, you've probably read a lot of books, and so you obviously have inspiration from other writers. So it only makes sense that some of the characters, factions, lore are based on other writers, their works, and references to them, etc. Just like some of the characters are also just references to cultural lore and mythology from, you know, Greek, Rome, Egyptian, Mongolian, etc. But it would be interesting to see kind of a timeline of what was put together earlier and what was put together more later on, because it seems like stuff that might have been put together earlier on in the 40k, like history, development, timeline, whatever you want to call it, seems to be a little more, I don't know what the proper word is, but maybe more, I don't know if well thought out is the phrase or terminology I'm looking for, but it just seems to have more lore and references, and a lot of some of the later stuff seems kind of like he said might have just been kind of, I don't want to say it was not thought out as well, but I guess, more simply referenced. I don't know how I would want to say it. But it's like you said, you know, like some of the characters you can easily see and pinpoint what they're referencing. The Raven Guard guys, you know, Corvus Corvax, named after ravens. The Iron Fist guy, you know, is Iron Fist with his Iron Fist leading the Iron Fists, you know, things like that. So it seems like some of the earlier stuff might have been more well thought out, more refined, more put together, and some of the later stuff might be more rushed, I guess is the term I was looking for. But great video from Arbiter Ian going into some of the more cultural references of the 40k universe, and how the Primarchs kind of in their chapters kind of got some of their founding and their lore. So, but yeah, like I said, check out Arbiter Ian's videos if you guys would like to. If you enjoyed this video, do consider leaving a like and a sub, as I greatly appreciate it. It helps me and helps the channel grow. If you would like to become a YouTube member, click the join button down below. Check that out, see if any of that interests you. If not, no worry. Just hanging out and watching these videos is really the only thing I need that helps the channel. That just helps the channel grow. And I appreciate it. Appreciate you guys coming in and hanging out. And yeah, that's it for this one. See you guys in the next one. Bye-bye.